This is Clive Priddle. I'm here with The Current. We have a 20th anniversary of 9/11 edition today. And I'm joined by three people who had an extraordinary role in especially the events that followed from 9/11. We don't want to skip past the awful tragedy of that day and the families who lost loved ones in that day. But what we're really going to talk about is some of the lessons and the enduring consequences of 9/11, since each of my guests was involved extensively in that. So joining us are Kenneth Feinberg and CAMILLE Biros. They were partners in administering the Victim Compensation Fund. They were tasked with dealing directly with the families at a moment of extreme grief and emotional despair, and asking them if there was a way that they could agree to settle the claims that otherwise would have been made against the airlines in particular, subsequent to the crashes on 9/11. Joining me also is Bill Arkin. Bill Arkin is a security and military analyst and commentator, and became extensively involved in explaining 9/11 and its immediate aftermath to us largely through NBC. So I want to thank you all very much for joining us today. We are speaking as one of the long consequences of 9/11. The war in Afghanistan has just come to an end. We're going to look at two or three other aspects of the aftermath of 9/11. But I wanted to start perhaps by asking each of you, when you first realized that an extraordinary day was unfolding, where were you, and when did you know that this was a day unlike any other? Perhaps I can ask Ken, you to take that one first, and then Camille, and then Bill.
I had just completed a class at the University of Pennsylvania Law School in Philadelphia. And I saw, as I was leaving the class on the student TV, that a plane had hit the World Trade Center. I took a taxi to the train station, expecting to return to my Washington law firm, only to discover that a second plane had hit, and that we knew this was not an accident. A couple of us on the train convinced a cab driver, taxi, to drive us. The trains were shut down, and we returned to Washington in the middle of all of this chaos surrounding 9/11.
I was in Provence, France, finishing up what started out to be an absolutely lovely vacation, and found out about it walking through a little town Aix-en-Provence, when another American couple stopped us and said, "Have you heard what's happened?" And then, of course, from that point on, it was chaos. We were trying to figure out how we can get home. And of course, there were no flights going back to the States at that time for several days. So that's where I was, trying to get back to my two teenage children.
I was in my home office in Vermont doing my work, and I got a call probably between about 8:30 and 9 o'clock from NBC News. And they said, "Have you seen what happened?" And I hadn't. Turned on the television, and it was between the first and second planes that had hit the World Trade Center. NBC said, "We have to have you in New York." I had been a long time military commentator for them. And I said, "You know what I know about Al-Qaeda, you could fit into a thimble." And they said, "Well, that's an ocean more than most people know, so get your ass here." And they actually sent a limousine to Vermont and drove me to New York while everybody was going in the other direction. And I was in New York that evening, working with NBC, being on the air, trying to explain what happened, try to explain what Al-Qaeda was, and what had happened, and what was to be expected in the hereafter.
So for you, Bill, the involvement was pretty much immediate. You were immediately there as a commentator. There was a lot of unfolding events. Ken and Camille, when did the events of 9/11 reach out to you directly and require your involvement?
Reached out to both of us the minute that Congress enacted the September 11 Victim Compensation Fund. In conversations that we had with my former employer, Senator Ted Kennedy, and Republican Senator Chuck Hagel, they both urged the Bush administration to ask myself and Camille to design, implement, and administer the fund. And we were involved in that whole effort in a matter of days, and thereafter were interviewed by the Bush administration, particularly John Ashcroft, the Attorney General, with authority to appoint an administrator or administrators. And it was seamless. We just went from learning about the fund to being considered, to being actively appointed, and beginning the process of designing the program.
I want to ask you an almost impossible question, but it seems to me in all cases, you began your work or your analysis of this period, consequences of 9/11, and I assume that you could not have known the totality of what you were going to discover, of what you were going to be involved in, of the engagement that you were going to have. So could you give us some sense? Maybe Camille, I can ask you to start with this one. When you were asked to administer a fund, what did you think that process would entail, and how different was it in practice than perhaps your initial expectations?
Well, I can tell you things moved very, very rapidly. The president signed the bill into law in September 22nd. And Ken was appointed in November, and we had the program pretty much up and beginning in late December of 2001. So we were working at warp speed to try and have everything in order and everything ready to go so that we could do our outreach to all of the families. We did not have time, nor could we ever have been prepared for the emotions that were going to come our way as soon as we began holding these town hall type meetings, with the first one in November of that year, when we started having conversations with the families who lost their loved ones in such a horrific way. So we needed more time to prepare ourselves for what we were about to face. But we just immediately walked into the situation.
You're a very experienced lawyer. You've had a long public career, a private career too. Had you ever faced anything like the prospect of that first meeting with the family? Did you feel that you knew what you were getting into, that your previous experience had prepared you for that?
No. You see, Camille's absolutely correct. It's one thing to design a program and administer a compensation program months or years after the traumatic event. Agent Orange is a good example, where we designed and implemented a program 9 years, 12 years after Vietnam. Here, we were asked to compensate victims and their families within weeks of the tragedy. In fact, we were discussing compensation with families that hadn't yet recovered a body of a lost loved one. So the emotional overhang of the underlying event that triggered the whole fund was so proximate to the date when we began that Camille is correct in saying that we confronted an emotional tsunami of anger and frustration.
And how do you feel? We're partly talking to you because of the recent release of the film Worth, which is based on your book, Ken, What is Life Worth? How do you feel the film does in terms of representing the moral challenge that you faced as the arbiters of the fund, and also the emotional context in which those conversations were taking place? How did you feel watching that?
Well, I can tell you two things and turn it over to Camille, because you've asked a very good question. I personally had grave reservations that any movie could accurately transpose to the screen what we went through, to the movie screen. I must say, surprised and pleased that the film does go a long way in conveying what we confronted. In terms of the moral imperative, I think the film points out in very clear terms. Camille, played by actress Amy Ryan, is the moral center of the film. And I must say, Camille, better than anybody, can respond to your question about conveying the moral dilemma we confronted during the course of the 9/11 fund.
This was a time when same-sex marriages weren't recognized. This was a time when there were numerous undocumented workers' families who were involved. And it was extremely difficult for us. We wanted to be certain that the appropriate people were receiving the compensation. So in the case of a same-sex partnership, we would try and convince the family that the partner should receive a certain amount of compensation. In most cases, we were successful, but there were some where the parents, the family, refused to even acknowledge that type of relationship. And so we found out so many things about unconventional families in this country and tolerance or lack of tolerance of those different types of families. That's one of the things we were most proud of, the fact that we were able to pay some same-sex partners, the fact that we were able to pay some fiancés whose families refused to acknowledge that that was a relationship, and the fact that we convinced 11 undocumented workers to come into the program after guaranteeing them that they wouldn't be deported. So there were so many different aspects of this fund that were challenging.
And in the end, it was an enormous success. Let's not overlook that. The percentage of people who accepted your offers in your arbitration was, Ken, tell me what the number was. It's in the high.
That's right. 97% of all eligible families that lost a loved one at the World Trade Center, the airplanes, or the Pentagon voluntarily, this was an optional program, they voluntarily agreed to enter the program instead of filing a lawsuit against the airlines, the World Trade Center, etc. Only 94 people decided to sue, and they had that right, but they all settled their claims in court within a number of years. Only 2 people, a priest and a mother, I think she was in her early 80s, who lost a son. Only 2 people opted to do nothing. They didn't come into our fund. They didn't ever file a lawsuit. They sat and did nothing. Our biggest disappointment in the entire fund for 33 months, we couldn't convince the priest or the elderly woman to opt either for our fund or to litigate. Instead, they did neither.
So that's fascinating. At the bottom of this, as you point out, is a sense that there was some body or some institution that was in some way culpable here. That is why the families were able to think of suing. And the first target was, I think, the airlines. And then, as you point out, the World Trade Center and so forth. Bill, I want to switch the conversation across to you a little bit here and talk about this issue of culpability. Your book on that day is a very meticulous topic of who knew what and when, who acted on what knowledge and when. How do you feel when you're thinking about the culpability of the airlines? Let's just start with that. In terms of what they knew on September the 10th and the way they carried out their business versus what they were deemed to be culpable for by 10 o'clock on September the 11th. How do you feel they handled that process?
Well, if anybody is responsible, and I put that in quotes, I guess I would say that it's the airports, because the security that people go through, even in those days, to get on an airplane does include walking through a metal detector and potentially being inspected more than once, hand wanded by a security officer, or having their suitcases and carry-on bags inspected. That actually did happen for 3 of the 19 hijackers. They went to secondary inspection and they were all passed through. In one case, a person's luggage was held off the plane until it was confirmed that he had boarded, and then the luggage was placed on the plane. So if anybody is responsible, it's Newark Airport and Dulles Airport and Boston Logan. Those are the responsible airports for this. Of course, on a mega level, the U.S. government is responsible, not the airlines. The U.S. government is responsible because of the intelligence failure that was a part of 9/11. They're responsible because they failed to do their basic job. And here we are today, despite this compensation fund and despite blue ribbon commissions and all sorts of reviews, where nobody in the U.S. government has really ever been held accountable. No one was fired, not an airport screener, not a director of the CIA, and nobody decided to resign in shame as a result of 9/11. In fact, they segued very quickly into a war in Afghanistan and then a war in Iraq, and that took over. So the irony is that the responsible parties really have never been held accountable. And though we've created a 60,000 person Transportation Security Administration and changed the entire airport security apparatus as a result of 9/11, in some ways you could say that was a reward to the government in terms of just getting bigger and becoming more powerful. And certainly my observation overall would be that we saw the largest reorganization of the government since World War II after 9/11, with the creation of the Department of Homeland Security, with the creation of the Director of National Intelligence, and the military and the intelligence community were in some ways beneficiaries of 9/11 in the sense that their budgets skyrocketed and their power within American society equally so. So, I think it's interesting. I would ask Ken, because when he was describing the compensation fund, he said that people were dissatisfied, and I wanted to know what it was that they were dissatisfied about, because I think it happened very quickly. It happened very quickly that people started to ask questions, and I know that there are many, many different types of attitudes about 9/11, and there's still a significant percentage of Americans who don't believe the official story, who don't even believe that airplanes hit the World Trade Center or the Pentagon. But overall, I think this level of dissatisfaction was bred by the lack of taking responsibility and accountability on the part of government, and it has really served as the genesis of so much of political discord which exists in America today.
Well, I think, there were the reasons for the dissatisfaction were as numerous as human nature. You're absolutely right, Bill. Some express dissatisfaction. It's a cover-up. You're buying us off. There was some of that. There was some dissatisfaction just about the inhumanity of it. Here you are, CAMILLE BIROS, offering me $3 million. They haven't even discovered my son's body yet. I received, an arm and a leg in a body bag. And you're here talking about money. The timing was an irritant, fueled dissatisfaction. And, some people expressed outrage that God was responsible, or that there can't be a God. No God would allow this to happen. So there were various reasons But the underlying point that Bill just made is absolutely true. And that is, to this day, there has never been an apology, not only from the government, from anybody, not from the airlines, not from the World Trade Center. No one has ever accepted responsibility for 9/11 attacks. It was a sneak attack from foreign terrorists. And final point, buried in the law that created the fund was the right of the government to seek reimbursement of what it paid out to families from the airlines, from the World Trade Center, from the Port Authority and Massport. Well, the government never tried to seek that reimbursement. If the government had ever sought that reimbursement, there would have been a lot of questions and litigation about who was responsible. So the government, at its unilateral option, let that lie. Leave it alone. Let's not get into that. And to this day, Bill's right. There's never been any sense of responsibility. This program, this compensation program, most certainly was not reparations. Reparations are when you apologize and then offer compensation to repair the wrongdoing. This was mercy. This was simply patriotism and a desire to divert airline lawsuits, but it certainly wasn't an expression of responsibility for what happened. Nevertheless, final point, the program worked. It worked just as Congress intended. It compensated virtually everybody quickly, generously, and at least as to that goal, let's at least provide those innocent victims with some degree of financial stability. The program did exactly what Congress intended.
Let's ask about one or two of the other sort of consequential pieces of this. So the program worked, and as you say, Ken, the families could never be made whole, but they could be saved from destitution and short-term suffering because of their financial situation. And that was an extraordinarily rapid accomplishment. Bill, there were other pieces of this story that also seemed to need rapid change. You say there was a big institutional change in government over many years. Reading your book, one of the things that struck me very forcibly was the level of confusion that was evident pretty much everywhere on 9/11. And of course, one can understand that. It was, as Ken said, an unprecedented sneak attack. You don't get to prepare for those. But when it was known that the attack was underway, the response was chaotic. We scrambled jets and we had them in holding positions, looking for planes that had already perished. They were holding in the wrong position to do any defensive good. Do we think that the lessons of 9/11 for national security agencies, for military agencies, for the Air Force, do we think those lessons were learned, or is it similar to what Ken just referred to, which is there was no great public airing of this, and therefore it was easy not to get to the bottom of some of the mistakes. It was easy not to learn.
Well, the body politic in America has a bad habit of losing and then declaring victory. And I think from the very incidents on September 11th, the government not doing its job in terms of protecting Americans, its fundamental purpose, and then at the same time, the FAA not being able to figure out what was going on, the military being confused about the rules of engagement regarding airplanes in the sky, the intelligence community being completely in a muddle, and the president unable to communicate and being outside of Washington, and the continuity of government system completely falling apart. All of that sort of just exposed what is common within government, but we pretend, we play a theater that it's not so. And we've seen that same theater play out in this past month in Afghanistan, which is one of the products of 9/11, the first product of 9/11, a war that began on October 7th, so barely a month after the attacks. In that we declare that the war is over, and we even seem to want to create the impression that mission was accomplished, when the reality is that that country could fall back into the exact same disarray that it was in 2001 before 9/11. So to me, the inability of the government to take responsibility is really what I've focused my attention on over the years. And it's not unique to 9/11, but yet we didn't seem to learn from 9/11 that the intelligence agencies can't be trusted. We didn't seem to learn after 9/11 that the presidency isn't omnipotent. We didn't seem to learn after 9/11 that terrorism was an important factor in our lives, and that even in this discussion today, we've hardly mentioned the terrorists themselves. Was it actually a bolt out of the blue attack? I don't think so. I mean, 2 U.S. embassies had been attacked 3 years earlier, simultaneously at the same time, hundreds of miles apart in Africa. The USS Cole had been bombed in Yemen in October 2000, just less than a year before 9/11. And so, to me, I think that there are some serious civic consequences of what we both did and didn't learn on 9/11. But the most important are obviously government accountability, as we've already discussed. Second, that we don't care about and we don't care to learn about the terrorists, who they are as people, what their motivations were, what their objectives were, and our continuing disinterest in understanding the terrorist mind and people who take up arms against us. It bites us in the rear. It continues to do so because we have no interest in understanding what their motivations are, or repairing a world that is so uneven and unjust to them. And then I think finally, we undertook our own national compensation fund, which is to say we bought off the intelligence agencies, we bought off the military, we created a gigantic Homeland Security Department that has, now has got its fingers in everything from cybersecurity to election security, everything else but terrorism, the purpose in which it was created. It seems like the national security establishment were the main beneficiaries of what happened on 9/11. And as a result of that, I can see why there's so much distrust and so much confusion that still lingers in the American public mind as to what happened, why it happened, and what the government actually did about it afterwards.
So, Camille, one of the great accomplishments of the fund was that you and Ken were able to be as quick as you were. I mean, you could never write this wrong, but you could at least respond to it, and you responded to it fast. And it was an amazing accomplishment to get such a large number of people to agree to accept settlement. When you look back at it now, do you feel that there was anything that you could have done better? Did it go as well as it possibly could have done, or do you feel that there were aspects of how it took place that you would like to do over and improve?
Looking back, I think we did as well as we possibly could. I think we were able to devise a plan immediately to get some immediate money to the families before we with working with our accountants did a full-blown analysis of what their losses would be. So we were able to, at least for those families who were in dire straits and needed money, we were able to get them some emergency money, which is not that easy to do working in a sort of a government construct, but we were able to do so. We also offered one-on-one meetings with the families, and so many of them wanted to have those one-on-one meetings just so that they could tell their story to an individual, what happened to them, and to talk about their loss, not necessarily to talk about the compensation, but to talk about the hurt and the pain that they experienced and that will never go away. The only thing I would say that we could have been better prepared for, and I'm not sure how you do that, is immediately to be ready for the unimaginable emotion of the families in those early weeks and months after the tragedies.
Let me just add, Clive, to what Camille said when you asked, do something different. From 30,000 feet, I can tell you two things. One, you'll never see a fund like this again. The 9/11 fund is a precedent for nothing. This was a one-off response to an unprecedented historical domestic catastrophe, rivaled only by probably the Civil War, Pearl Harbor, and the assassination of President Kennedy. And I think that this fund, which used public money to compensate private wrongs, damages, you hadn't seen it before, and I don't think you'll see it again. And you shouldn't. I think the program did exactly what it was supposed to. I think it worked. It was sound public policy. But I don't think you'll see it like this again. And the other thing, if we had it to do over, was not our doing. The minute Congress enacted a law that said everybody has to get a different amount of money instead of all lives are equal, well, that guaranteed divisiveness, anger, frustration. Mr. Feinberg, Ms. Biros, you're giving me $2 million tax-free. How come you gave my next-door neighbor $3 million tax-free? What do you have against my wife? You never even met her. So, I mean, Congress created the construct. Camille's correct. We decided in a bold stroke that I think made the program a success. We decided to give everybody who wanted it the opportunity to be heard privately. And that made a huge difference, even though it was very, very debilitating.
How much did the fund pay out in total?
$7.2 billion.
It sounds like a very large sum of money, but we're also in the reckoning, for example, of the cost of Afghanistan. We're dealing with massively greater sums of money that were spent on that endeavor for limited long-term good, it seems.
But I think that the qualitative aspect of it is unprecedented. It's one thing to fund the defense establishment, whether you like it or not. There's a long history of public financing of the military. The idea that the federal government would pony up $7.2 billion and send checks directly to individual families and injured victims was guaranteed to cause problems. Bill talks about Heads Up, the USS Cole and the African embassy bombings. He didn't mention the most important precedent. Just 8 years earlier, the very same type of people attacked the World Trade Center and killed 8 people. There was no 9/11 fund for them. And their parents sent us letters. Dear Camille, my son died in the basement of the World Trade Center in a terrorist attack committed by the very same type of people. Where's my check? And, we have a hollow response. Go ask Congress, but that didn't get us very far.
So it couldn't be fair, but it could be something.
Fair is the wrong word. Don't ever use that word, fair, or justice, to describe the 9/11 fund. It was neither fair. You're giving people money for a lost loved one. It's mercy. I use the word mercy. I think that's a more appropriate word than fair or just or anything like that.
It's an extraordinary accomplishment, and I'm very glad, 20 years later, it's clearly moving into a moment of history. I have children who were not alive when this happened, and so one has to explain 9/11 from scratch. It is being turned into documentary films, dramatizations, as worth is. I want to thank you all very much for joining us today and reminding us of what the immediacy of that experience was like and your role in it, how difficult it was to appraise in those very early days, because some of that is lost now with the long benefit of hindsight. And also reminding us of the many imperfections that remain, despite a lot of best efforts to recover from 9/11. My great thanks to Camille Biros, Kenneth Feinberg, and William Arkin for joining us on The Current today.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Hachette.